All right, seeing none, we'll move on to our next one, which is discussion of information items. We have a presentation from PMA, our financial planning program, by Howie Kraus. Is that the updated one? Okay.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I think I've met most of you. I'm Howie Kraus from PMA. What we wanted to do this evening is talk about the financial projections as they're currently sitting, helping to create a base model as we look forward, and then provide some look backwards at where we were at this time last year, as well as the update that we provided in May. So we are using your audited reports. However, with FY12, we're using cash balances. As you are well aware, Cook County, for the first time in my memory, got tax bills out and collected prior to the period in which your auditors would accrue money back to FY12. And so to prevent, when we look forward, having a spike in one year and then some dramatic drop the next year, we went back to cash balances, assuming that the county will be consistent. That would make it very easy, or if they go back to a system in which we'll collect the taxes after September, would be more in line with what you saw in your annual financial reports prior to FY12. We're using the FY13 budget to project forward. So we have the history to provide us with an idea of where we were, but we're looking at FY13 and moving into the future, particularly looking now at this timely point in the year, looking at potential tax levies and extensions, your EAV, your enrollment, and so forth. On the next page, if we can talk about the financial highlights, you had a deficit, a significant deficit projected last year. You spent about $600,000 less than your budgeted expenditures in FY12. You all were participants in how to bring that to fruition. We are talking about the operating funds from the rest of the presentation, those that are part of the general operations of the district, including the education, operations and maintenance, transportation, Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund, and the Working Cash Fund. The audited noted that revenue issue that we were just addressing in my comments. And that's the quote from the audit, that it was largely due to the unusually early 2011 tax collection dates. So we've adjusted the AFR revenues to cash balances on June 30th, 2012. On the next page, annual financial report, sorry. The budget highlights for FY13, you do have a projected deficit this year of about $280,000 in those operating funds, a much smaller projected deficit. I think as you've honed in on where your expenses are and some consistency in the way the budget's put together, you see the benefit of that being more to the point. The district gets about 92% of its revenues from local sources, primarily 85+% from local property taxes. The good news on that is that you are primarily dependent on your local resources and not very dependent on the state. Only about 4% of your revenues on the next slide coming from general state aid, and about 3% from categorical payments from the state, and about 0.7% from federal. And as we'll talk about, that's a good thing generally. If we will get to the revenues or the expenditure side, salaries and benefits make up about 76% of your operating expenditures for the year. And you will note, as you went through painfully last year, a reduction of about 9.4 full-time equivalents from last year's staff roster to this year's. So if we then go to the local revenue page, thank you. Talk about the assumptions that are now in the model after working with the Finance Committee, Dr. Skinkus, Mr. McGinnis. We're using 1.5% consumer price index in last year's levy, which generated the dollars this September. Then for your levy upcoming, the CPI to be used, consumer price index, is 3%. That came out last January. And as you know, then the consumer price index, the CPI that you will use in the future levy a year from now, will come out in mid-January. But we've used 2% in future years. And I would indicate that a 1% increase in the consumer price index under the tax cap by itself equates to about $185,000 of new revenue. Existing EAV, equalized assessed valuation, is projected to follow a reassessment pattern that was more common before this last reassessment of a 5% increase being flat in the next 2 years. That's what we had seen historically in the area. The last reassessment that came a couple of years ago was reflective of the housing market crash and had a larger drop rather than that increase. New property is estimated at $2.5 million per year, and again, to give you a sense, $1 million of new construction would generate about $21,000 of operating tax revenues to the district. General state aid, this year, as you I'm sure have heard multiple times, the state of Illinois was not able to fully fund the general state aid formula, and so it prorated the amounts given to every district, reducing it by 11%. And the outlook, what we're hearing certainly from the state staff, is to expect that we're going to have a long-term situation in which revenues do not meet the formula requirements, and so that type of proration is likely to continue, barring changes in the formula itself that the State Board of Education may consider over the next few months to a year in how general state aid is distributed. Again, luckily, because it's only 4% of your revenues, the impact on you would not be great in dollar terms, but it still will be significant changes across the state if some of those things occur. The federal revenues, I think it's simply a matter of talking about the potential that if the budget discussions in Washington have an impact on the Department of Ed, which almost certainly seems to, that we would anticipate that there would be some reduction in federal dollars going out to school districts, but we have heard no sense of what that might be other than the quote-unquote 10% automatic sequestration and how that would impact specific programs. When we look at the next slide, this is just pictorially showing where equalized assessed valuation is going. The tax year 2011, in which you had about $891 million of EAV, and flat for 2 years before a 5% increase, then flat for 2 and 5% up. On the next slide, representing the new growth projections in the district, you also see the history back in tax year 2008, in which you had $6.8 million, $6.6 million of new construction, and it's dropped off significantly. But even in the last 2 years, 3 years, it's been relatively consistent at that 2.5, just slightly over 2.5 million.
So Howie, let me ask you a question. The Edward Don facility in North Riverside is supposedly close to the deal, knocking that down and putting Costco in. Is that considered new, or is that considered, because you're going from a warehouse to, to more of a retail type?
My assumption is that would be considered new construction, in that the facility is empty, as I remember. So it has relatively little value for EAV, but that would be something you probably need to talk with the assessors about to be sure of. Okay, the general state aid on the next page, again, looking at where we were projecting a continued reduction from the formula, but because enrollment is going up we still were anticipating that general state aid would go up in the next couple of years as your ADA, your average daily attendance, has been up and is expected to increase with your enrollment. There's a lag on when you get general state aid, so you see it peaking in the projections we have in 2016 and then starting to go down, subject to those issues we talked about.
I don't understand this.
Okay?
Especially the increase from 2014 to 2016. It's almost a 33% increase in general state aid, and you said the people you talked to, the state said we should see less collection in our, we're not increasing our student body by 33%, so how does that, could you explain how that, the support for that?
The factors that would go into that are your assessed valuation staying flat,
Okay.
and having some impact from those drops that you saw. There's a delay, a lag in having that impact the dollars that you get.
For general state aid, it's based on assessed valuations?
Yes, there's a component of local resources that is the most significant component, because general state aid is intended to make up the difference between the local resources and the quote-unquote foundation level of 6,119. So you've had some reduction in your assessed valuation, which would reduce, concurrent with an increasing enrollment, reducing the per pupil resources at the local level. Then the average daily attendance going up with enrollment going up. And finally, a small rise in your poverty count, the students who are eligible for free and reduced lunch. The Department of Human Services portion of the grant is not tied to the local resources, but rather to the percentage of students in the district who qualify for assistance. And so that portion is going up faster than the general state aid formula portion.
So the collection also, or the payment to us, is a little bit in the rears. So although some of these changes have been happening, we don't kind of catch up with that in state aid until
There's always that
2016.
delay
Right.
of a year to 2 to even 3 years before some of those factors play into the formula. On the expenditure side, on the next slide, the breakout of your operating funds on the expenditures, 61% in salaries, 15% in benefits. The other portions there, the purchase services, including outsourcing of contractual services, and that total of expenditures in your budget of just under $20.2 million. So talking about the expenditure assumptions in the base model, you have a contract in place through FY13 with future years to be negotiated. We've simply put in a placeholder to project forward.
What's the placeholder?
The placeholder was the consumer price index.
Okay, next. I mean the projected of what, 2% a year?
Yes.
Okay.
Health benefits, the projection is an increase of 7% per year. And then on the remaining portions of the budget, most of the increases were also projected at that CPI number, the 2% per year. There were a few differences, and the largest of those were that the other objects category, which includes tuition payment out for students, increasing at 10% a year, and then adding in $100 or $100,000 per year increase in technology purchases beginning in FY14, reflecting the one-to-one initiative.
The biggest item in this category is Aramark, isn't it?
salaries, right?
No, this is
Looking
not.
at the
This
pie
is
chart?
Purchase services.
What page? All right, I'm on the wrong page.
Don't we have a escalation clause in the agreement? Isn't it 3% or something like that?
That's CPI.
I don't think it is.
Aramark goes up by CPI, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think it does, but obviously we.
This,
I think we should
that's why we
check
paid
it.
3, that's why it was 3% the last year, because in January, the CPI was 3%.
Okay.
Question, the 100,000 increase in technology purchase, how did that come to be one of the assumptions?
I asked Howie to put that in there. So, I mean, I mean, what we're just trying to do is we do financial projections planning for something like that. If we see that we can't afford it, then we would pull that out. But I wanted to have something in there placeholder that we need to start planning for the future. Don't know if 100,000 is enough, not enough, maybe could do less, need more. But I figured we'd have something in there to start figuring out what we need to do.
On the next page, the enrollment projections graph again showing we are seeing projected increases in student count over the next few years, looking at what your feeder schools are doing. Staffing projections then at the 85.9.
I'm sorry, is this Tim's, are these your numbers?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
On the staffing projections on the next page, going along with the current student-teacher ratio and increasing staff or decreasing staff as the enrollment changes. And so moving at the current level from 85.9, an increase through 2016 before we would anticipate that if the enrollment were dropping, that the staffing would drop concurrently.
I just want to ask you a question about that. Except for the change between 2013 and 14, which it's a 1 to 26 student ratio, all the rest of them are 17 to 1. Is there a reason there was a big difference between 2013 and 14 and the other periods?
I'm assuming they're using the same parameters that the state uses maybe on the report card? And this would include special ed guidance counselors and...
One of the, I'd have to go back and look at the number we were using, but it was intended to be the same percent student-to-teacher ratio as we have currently.
Okay.
It's not.
So we just gotta check
The
that out.
change from 2013 to 14 is 26 to 1, and the change the other years is about 17 to 1. Unless I just calculated it.
We'll review that and get back to you with any change that might project. On page 14, historical perspective.
17.1.
What we've done there is simply bring you a table of the information from the annual financial reports with the fund balances. Again, everything here is in those operating funds as we identified. So in terms of operating surplus or deficits at that line right in the middle, year to year, you'll see some other financing sources in just below that. You'll see one addition, perhaps from earlier numbers, under 2010, a change of $307,000 deduction. That was a note in the AFR from your auditors in 2010, an adjustment, and similarly in 2011, an adjustment that in two funds that totaled $57,000. And so the through 2011, those are from your audit. 2012 cash balances. 2013 is from your budget.
And 12 is significantly higher because of the early tax collection, so the way it's accrued.
Correct. If you looked at your treasurer's report, you'd see probably another, I think, 7 million, 8 million, something like that, in additional revenues that would have been booked in FY12.
Let me make sure I understand this one. So if I look at the fund balance as a percent, the bottom two sets of numbers, through 2011, is it on a cash basis?
No, it is on an accrual basis
So
from
in
your
2012 is on an accrual basis. 2013, how did you, it doesn't match we budgeted, I pulled it up to have a 28.79, $8.5 million year end.
Is that on a cash basis, 2013?
On this historical perspective,
Yeah.
those ending balances are not cash basis.
The 14 million and
14,
the
and
second number from the bottom is brought forward from the early collections.
So the $13,800,000 ending balance is not what we have budgeted on a cash
Right.
basis.
because the number right above that is brought over.
So should we consider this being that part of an accrual basis then, and not based on our budget, or what should we be thinking of?
The number in FY12 is effectively a cash basis on June 30th. And that number becoming the beginning balance for FY13, and then looking at your budgeted change in fund balance and how that would impact from that 14.1.
What do you mean by effectively cash balance? Does that mean you accrued for the receipts we had during this year, like was done in the audit report?
Your audit was on an accrual basis.
Right.
And it accrued those tax receipts collected in August
Right.
back to FY12.
Right,
That was that early distribution that they noted in your audit.
right.
And so to try to keep this in some consistent order, rather than having 2012 look like this and have potentially seeing a deficit of $7 or $8 million in FY13, we evened it out to try to mitigate that accrual in FY12.
Just for this slide, because then you go back to,
Right.
you go back to a true cash basis, don't bring forward the revenue.
Correct.
Theoretically, I mean, this is our budget, but theoretically, we would have half of the collections have to be pushed forward, and then we would have a really mixed up picture here, right? Because by assuming you have a fund balance of 13.8 million, you're assuming next year's collection comes in August also, and we would push what we're gonna budget next year into this current year budget, are we not saying that? And you would really make a budget
We're looking at it
looking.
to be consistent.
Right,
And with the dollars to be accounted for as they were prior to
I think
2012.
on this slide, what you're showing is the impact, what we're trying to show, tell me if I'm wrong, is the impact of what we're budgeting here on a net surplus or level, right? Because,
Right.
and show what that would have on, because, I mean, what you did was you just rolled forward the audit statement with the budget. Is that not what you did?
The
for the
budget is placed on top
of the audit.
the cash
Yeah.
basis from June 30th.
Yeah.
So for us, people who didn't catch what you were saying still, here's why I ask these questions. We have a budget posted, which we approved. It says we project our cash balance to be almost 6 million. This presentation says our budget for 2013, without any note saying we made an adjustment, is 13.8. So I struggle all the time, and Kevin knows it, and Tim, is I like to see things match, so that if somebody asks a question, I could pull it up and, without a footnote or an explanation, and even what Gary just said, I'm still not quite sure you took part of the accrual from this year's and put it into last year's and left part of this year. Is that what you did?
Because the collection came in
Right.
earlier.
That I understand.
Okay.
And we've already had the audit report
Okay.
explained to us.
So-
We know the auditor took the revenues that came in with the first 60 or 90 days. 60 days, on an accrual basis, put them in as if we received them last year.
Right.
Okay, I understand that, but that's not what we budgeted for. We budget on a cash basis. So I'm trying to figure out so that I at least can understand, and hopefully other people can. Did you just do the same thing? Did you accrue the cash receipts from the first 60 days and put in last year's like the auditor did, or did you do something different?
No, effectively, we did not accrue the August collection back to FY12.
Okay.
We counted it as part of your cash basis
For 13.
budget for 13.
Which is why our fund balance looks so high.
for last year too, though.
I think if you look at the next 3 slides, which is more the projections, you see the cash basis, which is gonna make more sense.
Because the top part of
I mean,
that,
this is,
the top part of the historical perspective aligns with what we budgeted, the 296 deficit.
I agree with that.
yeah.
So we've counted some money twice. We've counted it in the fiscal year 12 once, and it's all, the same money is in the fiscal year 13 budget for revenue.
Tell me if I'm wrong here, but the purpose of this slide is not necessarily to look at the progression of the fund balance, is to look historically at the revenues and the expenditures per year and what the surplus and deficit was during the year on this slide, because we're really mixing that fund balance becomes a little minutia of a lot of things those last 2 years out. But the key is that what we're consistently looking at is the revenues and the expenditures to see a pattern going on there, is it not?
Yes.
And that was the basis of this historical basis of the revenues to the planned 2013 budget.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, any other questions? All right.
So now we're looking forward at the revenue projections based on the FY13 budget, and there you'll see that consistency of revenues being counted in the same fiscal year each year. Again, the largest part of that coming from local property taxes. Then we go to the expenditure side, salaries and benefits on the top. You see the benefits changing, although we talked about health benefits being at 7%. There are other factors rolled into both the salary side and the benefit side, and then the purchase services moving upwards, including what we talked in terms of the CPI.
But us moving to an insurance pool help to reduce that volatility, right?
You would hope.
Okay.
I don't know the answer to that question.
What we're hoping is it improves the consistency and the projections so that we can plan on a consistent increase, where if we were when we were self-insured one year, you might get a spike, then you might get a drop, then you might get a spike. Depending on what gets passed in future legislation with new healthcare legislation, that will determine what the cost will be, even inside the cooperative. The good news about being in a cooperative, and Howie, correct me if I'm wrong, is that by having the 94 or 98 school cooperative now with the insurance, it helps kind of balance some of those offsets and makes your increases or your decreases be a little more consistent, correct?
That's the premise behind the co-ops, yes.
Could you tell us what CPPRT stands for?
Corporate Personal Property Replacement Tax.
Okay. And what was the basis for keeping the pupil activities the same for the whole period of time? Do you know, or Tim or Kevin?
It was just our assumption that that was gonna remain flat for that period of time, that we weren't gonna.
It's actually a conservative view based on the fact that our student population is increasing, right? But we're being conservative.
We tried to go in with most of our assumptions here as conservative. That's why we tied everything to kind of
Right.
CPI.
You know, even though we're projecting in 2016 a growth of, 120 kids from the 2013 timeframe, theoretically, you would argue that you're going to see higher pupil fees coming in. Not even if you increase it just by the number of students, but we were conservative.
Right.
Okay.
So on the aggregate projections page, bringing the two together, the budgeted deficit this year, this first blush of projections from the base model indicates that you're going to be very close to potentially having a small surplus in FY14, and then deficits that are in that $200,000 to $500,000 range in future years. we translate that to the next graph.
I just got one question for you. On the
Please.
aggregate projections, does that include anything that's gonna go on with the pension, and does it assume anything at all with this?
No, it does not.
Okay.
And the benefits, isn't the biggest part of that the health benefits?
That certainly is, yes.
And are your assumptions, you said you were gonna go we were looking at 7%. I realize part of the change is because we've got staff going up and down, but is that, I mean, why do we show the benefits for 2014 only less than 1% increase then?
Have the things that are relatively constant that impact the salary side benefits, the IMRF being relatively stable, very small increase, if any at all, no increase projected in the Social Security, Medicare costs, how those tie in. So that's what brings that number
What
down.
about the
We also-
7% though?
No teacher
ER.
We
retirements.
also have a decrease in the early
Teacher
retirement.
retirements.
This year our cost is 182,000, and we don't have anything projected in the next, we don't have any teachers retiring as of right now where we're gonna pay any penalties.
So that's another assumption
that's
that there's no
another drop.
early retirement?
And the trade-off of that is that you projected a straight 2% increase in teacher salary, or CPI increase in teacher salary, with the thinking if you're gonna have retirement, you would typically take the perception would be typically a higher salaried teacher to a lower salaried teacher, right?
Right.
So there's that trade-off.
On this page, the red line is looking at the fund balances over a period of time. In those operating funds, with the education fund balances being represented by the bars on the far left, and working cash on the far right, and in between O&M, transportation, and IMRF. Those funds staying relatively stable, with the education fund taking the majority of the deficit projected in what we have. Wanted to compare that to the aggregate projections that you saw a year ago at this time. What I would tell every board is that the slope of the line is more important than the numbers, that you're looking at the general direction of the district's finances, as opposed to thinking that the number in 2018 or 2017 is unforgivable and automatic. And so with the changes that you made in staffing, other changes you made in your budgeting for this year, you've flattened that line out considerably. Generally, that the assumptions that tie much of your expenditure side to the consumer price index, which drives most of your revenues, almost automatically says that you're going to be relatively close to balanced budget. So I want to give you that looking backwards. In May, we came back. We were partially through some of those changes. It was looking ahead at what you thought FY12 was going to do, and sort of first pass at what FY13 budget would look like. And we added a green line there. If you see it on the left, it's at $4,139,000. Request to show what would a fund balance of 20% of your expenditures look like over time, with the intent of looking at potential board direction of do we act when our fund balances drop below that.
So what does the state and you as a financial person look at for a good fund balance, not a greedy fund balance, or you know what I mean, but it's a realistic fund balance?
Right. You know, the state gives you the highest scores in its financial profile if you have 25% fund balance on June 30th. Cook County districts, the issue is more trying to, that June 30th is not your low point in the year. it tends to be right before that first distribution. If you remember a couple of years ago when the distribution was in December, where you were stretched out, not you necessarily, but Cook County districts were stretched out in their fund balances, trying to make it through, and the possibility that they wouldn't have enough money in the bank on December 1st to make what many districts had of bond payments due on that date. With this year, with monies coming in, your cash balance is obviously earlier. So, to your answer, I don't think there's a great answer anywhere that you could apply across the board. It's identifying for your district, when do you anticipate the low fund balance to be on a consistent basis, and what do you need on June 30th to move to that point to make sure you have enough money to meet your obligations.
And given your crystal ball again, this year was an anomaly on collection early. Do you see that going forward? Do you see that, or does it depend on trimester, where it's going to be at, or?
I think we were all shocked. I think with having a new process, new people involved at the county level who have said we want to continue to do this, until you get to a massive reassessment time, particularly for the Chicago portion of the county, I think they'll probably try to stay within that. It would be great. It certainly relieves a great amount of burden on the districts to get through to December, and having some certainty that you're going to get some money earlier in the year is good. So the page 21 is our same view, but with that 20% put there, which says essentially you would be above that 20% through most of our projection window.
Now, Howie, we are using in these projection status a 99% collection rate, correct?
Yes, we are.
Okay, so that accounts for any loss, with the adjustments we're making to our levy to account for loss of those taxes that are delinquent or that we receive not until a year or two later, those
Yes.
types of deals.
And then looking at your financial profile scores on page 22, the projection, you had a very high profile score this year. Again, because of the audit, we would anticipate it would be slightly lower. And then really the reason it's dropping into that early warning category is simply that deficit projected in those operating years.
And how does the state calculate the numbers?
There are 4 components to it: revenues to expenditures, the number of days of fund balance on hand to expenditures, fund balance to revenues, and the 4th one is debt, amount of long-term debt.
How are our area schools compared in score-wise?
I don't have enough information from those other districts that we do. So observations, again, you're projected to have deficits in the future. They have narrowed considerably from what we were seeing in projections a year ago. You're still feeling some of the effect of the economic downturn, particularly with new construction. The contract that you have in place through this year, subject to negotiations, and re-identifying those financial unknowns of where the CPI is going to be, because that is the largest driver on your revenues. Pension reform, which we've talked about at the Finance Committee. I certainly anticipate that in January some form of pension reform will be passed, and the high likelihood that there will be a cost shift to the employer of some portion of what the state is currently paying. And then healthcare costs are the big unknown on the expenditure side after you get past your salaries.
So as a board, if this pension shifts towards us, is that considered a cost or a benefit to the teachers for when you're doing negotiating contracts?
It's a cost to the district on your financial reports. the district gets no benefit from that additional shift to the district. It is there to support the benefit system in place for your certified staff.
And what is a key component that drives CPI, can make it fluctuate? Is that oil is a big thing?
It comes out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Department of Labor out of Washington, and it tries to roll together the change in the cost of a basket of goods for a normal city dwelling family from month to month and year to year. The two that have fluctuated the most recently have been, of course, gasoline prices and food prices.
And just so the board, just remind the board, our revenues are based on CPI and our levy, but we collect them a year in the arrears. So even though last January the CPI was determined to be 3%, we won't see that until this year's levy, and we won't receive that money till next fall, correct?
So given the fiscal cliff and the economic uncertainty in January, that's when the CPI is set.
Yeah.
What's your crystal ball saying about that?
Well, right now, it's through the number that came out on November 15th, which would have been through October 31st. The CPI was running at 2.5% over what it was last December. We don't look at year to year. We don't look at month over month. We're looking at the index number that came out last January 15th, and we're comparing the number that came out November 15th to that number, 2.5% increase so far. The volatility in November and December a couple of years ago drove the CPI in October from over about 5% to 0.1%, and the following year it drove it from 2.5% to 4.2%. So we don't know. You can sense what's happening at gas pumps right now, and you can sense what's happening at the grocery market. We were somewhat surprised that we were still running as high as 2.5% through October.
Any other questions for Howie?
So just so the board is clear, like, based on previous goals, these are, the goals to bring Howie back on an annual basis, to give these 5-year projections. Now that we have some more things a little more aligned to our operation in the model, the numbers we were facing a year ago, approximately a year ago today, have definitely improved, but there's still some things we needed to pay attention on. The staffing cost, if it is 17-1, that will come down slightly a little bit, but we do have the technology built in there. So, the projections are fair enough. Depending on the pension cost and collective bargaining issues, our other purchase service contract, I'm 99% certain it's tied to CPI. We have a good opportunity to stay close to balanced, if not shortly over budget. But we still have to think about some of those issues that are sitting out there, like we talked about, the general repair and maintenance of facilities, technology, even though that's in this model, and then other instructional items.
Howie, I got one more question for you. When you came in November and talked to us, when you came last time in May and talked to us about this, your scenario on pension was that they were doing a 1% all the way up to like 6 or 7%. First year, the state would give you the 1% as a rebate back to cover that, but then after that, when it went to 2%, you wouldn't get any money. Any scenarios floating like that around where the state would fund the first?
Yeah, we're trying to read the smoke signals. It still appears that the most aggressive plan being floated is a 1% increase per year until it reaches some actuarial number that right now looks like about 7.5%. From what we're getting from people who've been on that pension discussion, down to what was proposed in May was, I believe, 0.6% increase per year over 17 years. To me, I think the issues are that it has to be aggressive enough that it impacts the state economy enough soon enough. And I don't know what that, till we know what the speaker wants to do, I don't think we know.
Is there anything else that we should be doing different than what we're doing right now?
No, I think that the changes that you've seen from your, from the position we were in a year ago to where we are now reflect the work that everybody put into bringing in a budget as close to balanced as possible for this year.
Okay. Any other questions for Howie?
And the CPI is such a animal that 2.5% could evaporate December 15th, and it could become 4% January 15th.
Absolutely.
Depending on, you know, let's say the oil market for one major component.
Right.
And so we can't know in the crystal ball until they actually publish that. But like you said, you can get an idea. If gas is inching down these last few weeks, CPI is probably inching down as well. You know, we had a horrific drought in the country, which would cause food prices to go up, and that would affect the CPI going up.
Right. Those have been the things that the Bureau of Labor Statistics have highlighted in the last couple of months.
And
We
if
don't
it-
even look at it until September because we'd just be
And if they-
chasing something that has no value.
And if they can't feed the livestock and they dump the livestock on the market, then that brings that part of the food price down. So,
All right, any other questions for Howie?
December 11th, we will have our representative, Mike Zalewski, will be coming back to the Board of Education to update the board and answer any questions the board may have on public education funding and possible pension legislation. He'll be addressing the board and we'll have a few minutes built into, I was going to say seconds, I assume that's going to take a lot longer, for opportunity for the board and at a public meeting to address some pension concerns.
I am hearing one thing about with the pension is that they're talking about that COLA increase. If they can eliminate that or bring more in line, that saves like $80 billion. That's what I heard over the period.
Yeah, those numbers are certainly fluid, and each of the associations, whether it's a school board association or a school administrators or a ASBO or TRS, have analyses of what different components have been suggested in the pension reform and what some of the impact of each of those components might be. But everybody is still waiting for legislation to really be introduced. Most likely, we all believe in January.
So, just a question for you. On slide, the revenue side slide, which was page 5, your assumption or your general belief is 85.4% of our revenue is based on property taxes. That's an area that, depending on the talk on CPI, absent a tax referendum, we potentially have some growth based on the CPI. The other areas you believe with the state general aid is probably going to be a shrinking pie. Federal aid, we don't know what's going to happen. We budgeted, I believe the projections show that we kept it flat.
Yes.
And the only other area we have is other local, which is kind of our pay-to-play. The burden is on our parents. So the only area that, so the anticipation is that the property taxes become a bigger portion of the pie because the assumption is that the other revenue areas are going to be either stagnant or shrinking.
Yes.
And so therefore it leads that if 85 to 88% of our revenue, again, absent a tax referendum, is based on growth on CPI, the only way we're ever going to keep not growing into big deficits is expenditures have to grow at a CPI or less basis.
That's the way
Because it's not the full 100% of our revenue is getting a CPI increase.
Right.
Okay.
Any other questions? Howie, thank you very much. We appreciate you
My
being
pleasure.
here. Thank you very much for a good report, presentation.
Thank you,
Thank
Howie.
you.
Thank you very much.